After the murder of Jews in annexed Poland, the process was extended to those living in Germany and Austria, then to occupied Poland, where Jews were killed in the death camps at Belzec and Sobibor, while those from the Warsaw and Majdanek ghettos were put to death at Treblinka. The camps were all functioning now: Chełmno, Majdanek, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the latter, brand new installations would soon lead to an even higher yield from the machine of death.
When I received the order to organize the extermination at Auschwitz, I went to Treblinka to see how the extermination was carried out. According to the camp commandant of Treblinka, 80,000 people had been gassed in the course of half a year. His methods did not seem to me very effective. Our gas chambers could hold up to 2,000 people at a time, yet at Treblinka, each one held only 200. Inevitably, though, all the people living nearby Auschwitz knew that exterminations were taking place.
Auschwitz was the center of what I call the metropolis of mass murder, of this whole empire that would change the course of human history.
Halfway through 1942, a new strategy emerged at Auschwitz. Now, along with the Polish Jews being killed in the gas chambers, there were convoys of Jews coming to the camp from other countries, mainly from Western and Southern Europe. The problem was that there simply wasn't the capacity to kill so many deported Jews in the gas chambers at Birkenau, nor to dispose of all the bodies in the custom-built crematoria. The systematic mass deportation to Auschwitz of all the Jews had begun. Old people, women, mothers with their children. So the Nazis decided to increase the capacity of the gas chambers at Birkenau, where the Jewish deportees were killed, and of the custom-built crematoria.
These take on really industrial proportions by the summer of '42, when Himmler approves the creation of the 4 factories of death at Birkenau, which will be primarily for Jews deported from Western Europe, not for Polish Jews. Operation Reinhardt camps are to kill Jews from Polish ghettos, and Auschwitz is primarily to kill Jews deported from other countries outside of Poland.
And then brusquely came the end. The door flew open with all the noise of orders shouted in a foreign language. We found ourselves on a wide platform. A dozen seemingly indifferent SS quietly and impassively started rapidly interrogating some of us. Your age? And according to the response, they'd point us in one of 2 directions. Someone dared to ask about his luggage. Luggage later, came the reply. Another did not want to leave his wife. They replied, together again after. Many mothers refused to leave their children. They were told, fine, fine, stay with children. They had all the calm assurance of people who were just doing another day's work, while we ourselves were facing something terrible, apocalyptic. All was as silent as an aquarium, like a scene from a dream.
We could see, just yards away, the transports arriving from all over Europe, the selections, then just 300 or 400 yards away, the crematoria. I asked the grown-ups, how many Jews are there in France? How many are there in Norway? And in Italy? And I saw one community after another, one diaspora after another, get swallowed up and disappear. The people slowly moved forward in long queues, got swallowed in, then came out again in the form of smoke.
That evening, we were tattooed with our prison numbers and allocated to our Sonderkommandos. Our job was to transport the bodies from the gas chambers. Some of them were lying there still alive. The death throes had obviously been terrible. Women had miscarried in there. When the chambers were too full, they would throw children in over the heads of the ones already in. In the crush, some people were trampled to death. It took about 6 hours to get 3,000 bodies out. That went on for 8 days. Some of our group even threw themselves on the fire because they couldn't take it anymore.
One of the Sonderkommandos, Gradowski, kept a diary. He described in the minutest detail the people queuing up to die, what they talked about, how they insulted the SS as they went into the gas chamber. He himself didn't survive, but he buried his diary, his writings.
To whomever may read these words, this is just a tiny part of the hell that is Auschwitz-Birkenau. I stand near a group of women. They know and understand everything, that these are not shower rooms, that this is the antechamber of death. Each wants to know if her husband, her father, her brother is still alive, or if his body is lying somewhere or the flames have already consumed him and there is nothing left. We all stand petrified, unable to speak a word. Here and there you spot an acquaintance, someone you have spent time with. You have to harden your heart, feel nothing. Soon all these lives will be gone without a trace, as if they had never been born. But it was impossible, a nonsense to speak the truth to anyone who entered that crematorium. There, no one could be saved. There, it was too late. Several times I saw that, and it was the hardest thing. You never got used to that.
My mother and I were separated. She went off without looking back. I saw her going off, getting smaller and smaller. And I remember how her dress was blowing in the wind. And then she was gone. For a long time, I never understood the fact that she didn't even once turn round to look at me.
Himmler came to Auschwitz in the summer of 1942, witnessed the killing, the gassing of Dutch Jews, and it's during that visit that apparently his becoming too talkative at the social event where other people are present, hears what they're talking about, goes to Switzerland, and that's the origin of the Regner telegram.
Telegram by Gerhard Regner of the World Jewish Congress, a telegram in August of 1942 about a plan at Hitler's headquarters to exterminate 3.5 to 4 million Jews by use of poison gas.
Gerhard Regner, a German lawyer in exile in Switzerland, had been informed of the final solution by an industrialist with contacts in the Nazi high command. Regner sent a telegram to the American consulate in Geneva, which was passed on to Rabbi Stephen Wise, a leading Jewish American. The message was received by the US and by the Foreign Office with great skepticism, even hostility.
And then we knew from Swiss reports out of Switzerland about gassing. We knew everything.
That telegram got to Sumner Wells, Roosevelt's man. We don't know what Roosevelt said about that telegram, but we know what Sumner Wells said. We cannot release this to the press. Roosevelt avoided making any personal statement. And so it wasn't Roosevelt who spoke to the press, it was Rabbi Stephen Wise.
Rabbi Stephen Wise met with President Roosevelt for less than 30 minutes. He then gave a press conference in Washington where he announced that the Nazis had a plan to exterminate all European Jews and had already murdered 2 million of them. This information was relegated to minor news and didn't even make the front pages.
Also sets a target date. He wants the Jews of Poland to basically be liquidated by December of 1942. So many of those trying to please him are, in a sense, racing the clock.
The alarming news that was spreading like wildfire was unfortunately true. The Germans were demanding that all children under 10 should be deported. The panic in the town was incredible. The poor children's parents were trying to save them any way they could.
Ramkowski, the head of the Jewish Council, gave a speech. The sacrifice of children and old people was necessary. Nothing could be done to stop it.
The screams and weeping of the mothers, then of everyone in the street, was indescribable. The parents of the children who had been taken literally went mad.
When the Germans in early September 42 asked him to hand over all the children under 10, and he said to the families, "Give me your children," he was weeping when he said it. "I come like a thief to take away what is most precious to you," and he was really weeping as he spoke. And on the 5th of September, all the children were taken.
It was the worst. The most horrible moment for everyone. Children were killed on the spot or thrown out of windows. When the children were snatched from the arms of their parents, everyone knew what would happen to the Jews. They were taken off in lorries to the station at Radgast. 20,000 Jews were deported to the Chelmno camp, where they were all put to death. Later, all the houses were meticulously searched because some children had been hidden here and there. Some were found half asphyxiated in cupboards and other hideaways. They'd survived, but their parents were deported or dead, and they never found them.
In Treblinka, the initial commandant simply cannot figure out how to organize the camp in a way that will handle the huge numbers of people that are coming. Because he's getting up to 10,000 Jews a day, 5 to 10,000 Jews a day from Warsaw. He's getting transports from Radom, from Kielce, from the big cities of the Radom district, and the camp is overwhelmed. And he can't kill people fast enough or bury the bodies fast enough. So in early September, that's when Christian Wirth comes up and they dismiss him and they bring in Stangl.
Stangl was sent to put things in order. They didn't know what to do about the burial pits. The camp was in chaos. There were bodies everywhere.
And Stangl reorganizes the camp, enlarges the number of gas chambers. They build extra gas chambers. And Treblinka then very quickly becomes the most lethal camp than any of the others.
Stangl said, "I see them as a sort of cargo, a cargo that comes in and has to be liquidated." They got used to thinking of them not as people, but as an inferior race that had to be exterminated. It was a well-oiled extermination machine that didn't take much running, a real death factory.
The German assassins worked like machines. With blows from their sticks, they indicated one direction or another. You had to hurry before it was too late. We knew very well what going to the left meant. Hundreds of wagons already awaited their load there. To the left was Treblinka.
Jews have been killed since June 22nd, 1941, in thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and by now in millions.
I crossed the deserted, dead streets of Warsaw. No one lives here now. It's empty. The 4-story houses are sinister, plunged into darkness. An air of desolation reigns. Not so long ago, these streets were thronging, crowded with Jews, working, trading, cooking up new projects. We had faith in the future, and we believed that come what may, we'd make it through the worst. Now it's all sad, dead. There's not a Jewish soul left. Everyone here's been taken to the gas chambers.
Within the Warsaw Ghetto, the very young have gone. The children, the babies, they're gone. The old people, they're gone. Who is left in the Warsaw Ghetto? Young men, young women, who have jobs, the workforce, maybe 50,000 of them. And they know now what is in store for them. Sooner or later, they will be on the trains. They will go to the Umschlagplatz. They know now about Treblinka. They know the truth.
300,000 Jews out of the ghetto, deporting 265,000 to Treblinka, moving about 11,000 to forced labor camps, and shooting about 10 or 15,000 during the operation in the ghetto.
And they know they have nothing to lose. And there is a third change, and that change is Stalingrad. Jews hear about Stalingrad. The mighty Wehrmacht was defeated. The Red Army is advancing. Now is the time to get guns, to get grenades, to fight back.
These young people had seen their parents go, their brothers and sisters. They chose to die, to fight for honor, for history.
At the Warsaw Ghetto, all they had was a few pistols and rifles, and primarily fought with Molotov cocktails, throwing them at the German tanks and armored vehicles.
The Germans wanted to organize more deportations to Treblinka, but they were attacked. These young people with very few weapons attacked a German brigade and managed to repel it.
The assault on them was sufficient enough to cause them, as Stroop, the commander, reported in his first cable to Himmler, to maintain a controlled evacuation of the ghetto. Controlled evacuation is usually code for we got out of there really quickly. And in fact, the Germans took about 11 casualties on that first day.
Secret. To the commanding officer of the SS in the Eastern Territories Police. For security reasons, I order the immediate demolition of the Warsaw Ghetto, a constant focus of rebellion. Criminality will always persist as long as the ghetto is there. These dwellings must be destroyed. They are shelter to as many as 500,000 subhumans. Heinrich Himmler.
The defense of the ghetto was not unexpected. It was the logical result of 4 years of resistance by a population shut up in inhuman conditions, humiliated, despised, and treated according to the ideology of the victors as subhuman. By rising up, we remembered we were part of the human race. By taking up arms against those who wanted to wipe us out, we reached out to life and became free men. We fought for our own freedom and for yours, for our honor and for yours, for our human dignity and for yours.
Treblinka was now being underused. The great waves of Polish Jews are not coming anymore. And so he has a death camp that's available, that he decides to go ahead with the Saloniki deportations in the spring of 1943.
60,000 Jews, 3/4 of the Jewish population of Greece, lived in Thessaloniki. Almost all were deported to Auschwitz. 96% of the community was exterminated. Wehrmacht officer Kurt Waldheim was posted near Thessaloniki during the deportations. This did not prevent him from later becoming Secretary General of the United Nations and then President of his native country, Austria. He never expressed the least regret.
There were 50,000 Jews in Thessaloniki, but they even went looking for them on tiny little islands. Why deport the Jews from Rhodes? There was no logic to it. The Nazis wanted to catch every last one.
Himmler said on several occasions that the Führer has placed on my shoulders the heavy responsibility for carrying out his task of removing the Jews. And Himmler spoke openly about this to his SS leaders and the party leaders in a way that Hitler never did and never could do in his notorious speeches in Posen in 1943.
Himmler openly admitted the elimination of the Jews. He spoke of the glorious page in the history of the SS, which could never be written down. We still have the recording of that speech in his own voice.
Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein, und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Wir haben das moralische Recht, wir hatten die Pflicht unserem Volk gegenüber das zu tun. Dieses Volk, das uns umbringen wollte, umzubringen. Und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
And the Warsaw Ghetto uprising confirms that in his own mind. If you leave Jews alive, you are going to have uprisings, and that he now moves to systematically liquidate many of the camps that he has under his own control.
In early October 1943, the inmates understood that the gassing at Sobibor was winding down and planned an insurrection. The 600 prisoners rose up and attempted to flee. They killed a lot of German and Ukrainian guards. Of the 300 who managed to escape, more than 100 were recaptured and shot. Soon after, Sobibor was closed and demolished.
There was an uprising at Treblinka on the 2nd of August 1943. Then at Sobibor in October 43.
After the insurrection at the Sobibor camp, the situation changed rapidly. Himmler had ordered all the Jews to be killed because he feared a revolt. Special units came in from other districts, including the Lublin police force.
43,000 people killed in 2 days. This is the biggest single killing operation of the entire war, in which all the Jewish workers, with just 2 exceptions, are liquidated.
At Majdanek, it happened early in the morning of the 3rd of November. All the Jews were taken out to freshly dug trenches and were killed in those trenches. The victims had to lie on the bodies of others already dead or just wounded. And all the time they were playing music very loud to drown out the gunfire and screams. 18,000 people killed in one day. The camp was well protected. You couldn't go near it, but you could see the smoke from the incinerators. At Majdanek, most of the bodies weren't burned in the ovens, but on bonfires.
But
the Jews had to be eliminated. Of course, you could see the smoke, and the burning went on for 2 months. This was Operation Erntefest, one of the biggest extermination operations of the whole Holocaust.
It was only after he'd actually been there that Himmler gave the order to empty the burial pits, to unearth the bodies and burn them. He insisted on removing all traces of the murder.
Sonderkommando 1005 was responsible for the cremations. They dug up and burned the bodies from the pits and from elsewhere too.
They put a layer of bodies, a layer of wood, an enormous mountain of 1,000, 2,000 bodies. They poured petrol on it and set it alight.
You could smell the bodies burning for kilometers around. In the town of Belzec, the wind even blew in pieces of human hair.
z tych ciał, ale ten wiatr nawiewał na przykład ludzkie włosy.
Germans tried to conceal and hide all the evidence of their mass murder. All these sites were blown up after they finished their grisly activity, and they plowed over and put some grass, and so that if you came by, you wouldn't know that anything has ever happened there.
The ovens and gas chambers were all destroyed and almost all trace of them wiped out.
Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec had all been razed to the ground and made to look as though nothing had happened there at these places where between 500,000 and 900,000 people had been killed.
A Soviet offensive was underway. More important was the hope of a general offensive. Everyone's morale in the ghetto was tremendously lifted. People were thinking the war might at last come to an end.
"10,000 tons of bombs and incendiary devices were dropped on the cities, reducing them to cinders. It was all just a sea of flames. The water was boiling in the canals. The tram cars were melting.
In 1944, everybody knew Germany was going to lose the war. But Germany rededicated its efforts to the war against the Jews. It invaded Hungary on March 19th, 1944. They wanted to win the battle against the Hungarian Jews before they lost the war. And beginning mid-May, it deported the Jews to camps such as Auschwitz. Now, everybody knew about the deportation of Hungarian Jews. It was no secret. 2 men escaped Auschwitz and drew up something called the Auschwitz Protocol, which detailed exactly what was happening with Auschwitz, including the gas chambers and including maps.
The Americans and the British were asked to bomb Auschwitz about a month after the Jews started being deported from Hungary.
So Auschwitz was operating full force during this period of time, which meant that if you bombed it and you either destroyed the railroad tracks going to Auschwitz or the crematoria itself, you would have done something that would have hampered the Nazis.
Escapees from Auschwitz had just one request from their friends who were still imprisoned there. Tell them we don't mind. They should bomb the camp. This has to stop. In any case, we're already dead.
All the Jews who were there welcomed the bombs, even though they knew they could get killed on it, because it meant somebody cared. Once you know what's happening in Auschwitz, the idea of bombing Auschwitz, even if Jews die in the process of bombing Auschwitz, becomes something that's absolutely necessary. There were certain bridges that were essential to the deportation of Hungarian Jews. Had those bridges been bombed, it would have made it more difficult for the Nazis to pull off their task. It also would have told the Germans that we were onto them, that we understood exactly what they were doing, and we would have held them accountable to them. John J. McLeod, the number 2 man in the War Department, wrote a very famous letter. He says that such an action, even if practicable, might provoke a more vindictive response on the part of the Germans. You have to ask yourself the question, what's more vindictive than Auschwitz? Was Hitler being a nice guy? Was the infrastructure of Auschwitz that killed 1.1 to 1.3 million people an expression of what? Their non-vindictiveness? They requested of Winston Churchill that Auschwitz be bombed.
Churchill didn't follow up some things that were not at the top of his priority. When Churchill really, really wanted something, he got it done, and he didn't get much done with regard to bombing Auschwitz.
The Allies had already decided in January 1944 not to employ military means for civilian objectives. and the extermination of Jews at Auschwitz was not a military objective.
We can't save the Jews until we win the war. That was their argument. And we replied, but you haven't even tried.
It should have been unbearable, and it wasn't. If you knew what was happening, then anything should have been done, and it wasn't.
And Eichmann knew that was his job. His team, his men who went with him, knew that was their job. They had very good cooperation from the local Hungarians, and they were able to do it extraordinarily quickly, deporting 437,000 men, women, and children to Auschwitz in about 8 weeks, of whom maybe 1/4 was selected to work, and the rest were murdered.
And that's when Auschwitz overtook Treblinka as the most lethal of all the death camps. It's the moment when Auschwitz became Auschwitz, with all of its ignominy.
The photographs of Hungarian Jews arriving in Auschwitz, we don't know to this day why this photo album was compiled. We suspect that there was some purpose to report to Himmler step by step all of the glorious things he was doing.
That the evacuation plans were put in place by Himmler in the summer of 1944. And many camps in the path of the advancing Allies in Western Europe were evacuated in August, September, October, November of 1944, in the winter of 1944-1945. The entire command structure of the Third Reich begins to break down. And the commanders of the concentration camps are aware that the Russians in the east, particularly, are getting closer and closer and closer. They're very panicky. When they get orders to evacuate the camps, but they are not setting out to kill the prisoners. Even at the end of the war, in the last months, the Third Reich regarded the prisoner population as a valuable labor force. And the purpose of the evacuations was to move the prisoners from a place where they might fall into the hands of the advancing Allies to places, factories, farms, mines, where they could do something useful for the Third Reich's war effort. And it may seem crazy for the Nazis to believe that they were still fighting a war, or that they had a war effort, but they did believe that they could carry on. However, they were panicky. They were afraid. They were afraid of the Russians coming from the east. Sometimes there were 100 men to guard 1,000 prisoners. The prisoners had typhus and lice. These people were Untermenschen. And the Jews, they were evil, a source of danger. Sometimes the guards got together and they said, look, they're slowing us down. We could run away much more quickly if we just killed them. And what are they? They are enemies. And they smell and they're ill. Who cares? So in town after town, the guards and the villagers, men, women, young people, would join together, murdering the prisoners. The marches and evacuations turned into massacres and catastrophes on an extraordinary scale. So the extraordinary and terrible slaughter in the last months of the war was not planned. It wasn't deliberate. These marches ended up for tens of thousands in death, but they were not death marches. They were evacuations that collapsed into chaos.
It was the Red Army troops who discovered Auschwitz, Majdanek and Treblinka, either completely empty or with thousands of prisoners, all too weak to be moved on.
These places had never been liberated because they had ceased to function by the time the Red Army got there. The Soviets arrived by chance at Auschwitz. They didn't go out of their way to liberate the camp. The massacre was over and the traces of it had been destroyed.
And what's amazing when it comes to the Russians was that there was no great publicity straight away about the opening up of the camps at Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945. What then came out as images were reconstitutions that were done. And you can easily see, if you look at the ground, the snow, how the people are dressed, even how they look and their weight. You can clearly see that the Soviet crews had reconstituted it all. Probably 2 months after the camps were opened up. Most of the survivors of Auschwitz met up at the so-called Western camps. Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, all the camps that were liberated by the advance of the Western Allies.
As British and American troops advanced through Western Europe, they discovered the Nazi concentration camps. On the 11th of April 1945, American forces liberated Buchenwald and Dora. On the 29th, Dachau, and on the 5th of May, Mauthausen. When, on the 15th of April, British troops entered the Bergen-Belsen camp, they found 60,000 internees, many of whom had survived forced marches. Hundreds of corpses were strewn everywhere. The lack of food, the forced labor, the months and years of inhuman treatment had turned them into walking skeletons. Thousands of concentrate camp prisoners continued to die even after their liberation. For the rest, the return to normal life was long and difficult.
It was a real shock. Even if you'd heard the news, you couldn't really imagine what had actually gone on.
People were incredulous. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, and which means to me that they had never really internalized the news that they were receiving.
Alan Dulles was the head of the OSS, the head of the American intelligence abroad, later became head of the CIA. When he was told of the concentration camps, his response was very interesting. He said, so it's true. He had all the information. He didn't believe it was true.
I took a jeep to Dachau, and there were still all these dead bodies, dozens of them. They were lying about everywhere. And I thought, they're puppets, not human beings. They can't be human beings. But they were human, just like me. Atrocious. It was atrocious. I'd never seen anything like it. They couldn't speak. These people couldn't speak. There were no words to describe it all.
The Soviet army planned to surround Berlin and eliminate any resistance. Russian troops entered the northern suburbs with great loss of life from German opposition. The storming of the city itself began on the 25th of April. The German positions were overrun. Berlin radio managed to broadcast a last bit of Wagner, Siegfried's funeral march.
Hitler hardly appeared in public again. He shut himself away in Berlin, helpless.
Himmler had heard of Hitler's near nervous breakdown, where Hitler finally said the war is lost. It's the first time that any of his immediate entourage had heard him say it, which is extraordinary in itself.
Himmler
tried to sound out Goebbels to see if Hitler wanted to make peace with the Western forces.
Most of the Nazi leaders, in fact, were not prepared to go down on the funeral pyre with Hitler. Goebbels was one of the few who saw the reality of that way out. Most of them tried to save themselves, and Himmler was amongst those.
He offered his services to the Allies, but that was absurd considering the crimes he'd committed. He tried to make peace with the international Jewish organizations in a letter saying that they should draw a line under their disagreements, that it was all in the past.
Hitler learned that Himmler had contacted Western authorities, and that was why he was ousted and treated as a traitor at the end.
Hitler broke with him and relieved him of his duties.
And that was what threw Hitler into this absolute rage in the bunker in Berlin, wanted then to have Himmler executed. But of course couldn't get hold of him at the time. Hitler saw this betrayal as the last act, and it's probably Himmler's betrayal that then made Hitler realize now the time has come. There's nothing left.
Hitler dankt es ihm natürlich auch. Die sprechen viel.
Hitler and Goebbels met and talked for a long time. The others were trying to save their own necks, but they both just sat and remembered better days. Goebbels wanted to bring his wife and 6 children to the bunker. We assume he kept up his diary to the very end, in the Führer's bunker, but we don't have it. What we do know very well, because the document exists, is that when Hitler decided to marry Eva Braun, Goebbels was his witness, just as Hitler had been witness at Goebbels' marriage to Magda. We also know that Goebbels was present when Hitler wrote his will. Hitler finally chose him as his successor and appointed him Chancellor of the Reich. In the end, Goebbels had managed to beat all the competition, but it was too late. And Goebbels committed suicide, and he took his wife and 6 children with him.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. This is London calling. Here is a news flash.
Hitler fought two wars. He fought World War II and he fought a racial war. What he would call the war, what historians call the war against the Jews, the final solution to the Jewish problem.
Right up to the last week of the war, when there were no more trains, no more anything, when they couldn't even feed the population, there were still trains leaving for Auschwitz. It was like a religious obsession for him.
Before he died, he was still saying, it wasn't the Soviets who beat me, nor the Americans. It was the Jews, international Jewry.
It was one of the last sentences in his last will and testament. His last word to the German people was, I enjoin you to keep fighting this battle against the Jews.
Bauer, in his book, says a terrible thing, that in reality, Hitler started the war because of the Jews, and that was the only reason. Germany had no other reason for war. It had a developed economy, no more unemployment. It was Hitler's one and only dream. We have to destroy the Jews before they destroy us.
In the end, Hitler's true obsession was that. That was his real dream, to exterminate the Jews.
The Second World War ended on the 8th of May 1945 with the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich. The conflict had drawn in almost every country in the world on every continent. It had mobilized almost 100 million men and women from 61 nations, with hostilities that spread over 22 million square kilometers. It killed over 60 million, the majority civilians, among them 3/4 of Europe's Jews. A young German officer wrote, "At the windows of the villages we passed through, there were already white flags. They didn't expect any more Germans, and they watched us anxiously with hostility. We'd been the darlings of the nation, and now we were outcasts. There was no more glory to our flags. That's the fate of all vanquished armies."
After Hitler's suicide, Himmler was disorientated, confused. Very badly disguised, he tried to disappear amongst all the German troops. He shaved off his moustache and put a patch over one of his eyes. But he was soon spotted by the British. And when, under his own will, he was taken to a provisional prisoner of war camp, an English officer identified him as Heinrich Himmler, and he admitted he was indeed the head of the SS. He'd hidden a poison capsule in his mouth. A medical exam was set up to try to get it away from him, because they suspected he had it. But he had time to bite into it, and he died.
I can't rule out the fact that Himmler's suicide was convenient for the British.
When we got to Paris, we had a whole crowd of parents and friends harassing all these poor people. "Monsieur, monsieur, have you seen my husband, my son?" How I wanted to be able to tell them they'll be back.
There were still 1 million prisoners of war. So the whole French population was waiting for someone, either family members or neighbors or someone. So that came first. That was the main concern.
About 50% of the French political deportees came home in 1945, and 2.5% of the Jews. There were only between 2,500 and 2,800 Jewish deportees who came back to France, very few. The liberation of the Jews was swallowed up in the general liberation. The political survivors welcomed back with honour and glory, and the national anthem. Why not the Jews? Aside from the fact that they were so few and swallowed up by the crowd, there was also the fact that the so-called racial deportees, a dreadful term, represented something shameful. They'd been deported, they'd been martyred, and for what? For a voluntary choice to be resistant? No, just for being born Jewish. What's glorious about that? It's as if there was glorious deportation and then shameful deportation. Their deportation wasn't honoured because it was the shameful kind.
You can't rule out an element of residual anti-Semitism at the end of the war. It was mostly indifference, though. It was a reluctance to think about the matter. As Simone Weil says, we were a nuisance.
The indifference is undeniable, since the public didn't feel there was anything that stood out from the great mass of horrors, and in all the emotion of getting their political prisoners, and even more, their prisoners of war back, the sufferings of the Jews obviously didn't stand out. And we tend to forget a part of France, I say a part, had held profoundly anti-Semitic feelings from the 30s right up till 1944-45. So how could you expect France to stop being anti-Semitic as soon as de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées? It's one of the impostures of history. Clearly, for a section of French public opinion, there was an anti-Semitic attitude that if the Jews came back, they'd be demanding their property back. In a word, we thought we were done with them.
The prevailing feeling is that they're the last of the Jews. The feeling of being the only one to have survived.
About 1.2 and 1.3 million Jews were killed in the Auschwitz concentration camp complex.
Treblinka, I think the outer number is 950,000. Some have it as low as 750,000. Belzec, I think we now have a figure of between 400 and 500,000. Sobibor, about 250,000. Helmno, about 150, 160,000.
If you look at the total number of survivors of the 4 other killing centers, Helmno, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, the numbers are less than 1,000 out of a total of 1.85 million. So statistically, absolutely insignificant.
Holocaust has been accomplished. At any time beyond that, you can talk about the last, how many will survive, but the reality of the Holocaust has already been accomplished. Hitler has destroyed the bulk of European Jewry.